Howdy! This mini lecture will discuss environmental systems, ecosystem ecology, and ecological services as described in your textbook in Chapter 5. The student learning objectives of this mini lecture are: describe the nature of ecological systems by explaining feedback loops and identify positive and negative feedback loops, explaining and providing examples of emergent properties, defining ecosystems, explaining how living and non-living entities interact in ecosystem-level ecology, defining net primary productivity and explaining how it varies by type of ecosystem or biome. The other learning objectives of this lesson are: explain the cause and effect of eutrophication and how it can be prevented, define and provide examples of ecosystem services and explain how they benefit our lives, and finally, define watershed and assess the wicked problem of the oyster collapse in the Chesapeake Bay. As an introduction to the materials in this mini lecture, we first must consider the nature of ecological systems. The Earth's environment is comprised of complex networks of interlinked systems. As can be seen here in this image of an Earth system model, there are a variety of systems at play and interacting with each other. These systems include physical systems like matter cycling, molecules, and land formation development. They also include biological systems that include individual organisms, populations, and communities of interacting species. Ecosystems also include the interaction of biotic and abiotic components, that is, living and non-living components, respectively. Finally, the Earth's systems include chemical cycles involving rock, air, and water. These cycles influence cycling of nutrients and compounds, which in turn support life and regulate climate. To fully understand complex environmental problems, we need to acknowledge and comprehend these systems and understand how they work. Ecosystems are systems of interacting living, i.e. biotic, and non-living, i.e. abiotic, things. Ecosystems are defined as all of the organisms and non-living entities that are present in one area and which interact with each other in that area at a given time. Ecosystems can be as large as biomes and can be as small as the puddle in your lawn. In every ecosystem, there are inputs of energy, various processes transforming energy, matter being cycled through the system, and ultimately the system produces output, such as heat, water flow, and animal waste products. Energy flows in one direction through ecosystems. It arrives as radiation from the sun, powers the system by providing the inputs for photosynthesis, and exits the system as heat. Matter, on the other hand, is cycled through the ecosystem. Beginning with autotrophs, matter is created through photosynthesis, passed along through the food chain, and ultimately comes back to its starting point when organisms die and decompose. Matter is never lost in the system, it is just transformed. This is an example of the law of conservation of matter, which you read about in Chapter 2. Contrary to matter, energy leaves the system, drives the system, and exits the system as heat. As we discussed in Chapter 2, heat energy from the sun is converted to chemical energy, or sugars, through the process of photosynthesis. This process of photosynthesis is called primary production, because it is the first production of food or chemical energy in the food chain. The total amount of chemical energy produced by autotrophs is called gross primary production. Autotrophs need sugars to survive as well, so they use some of the sugars they make themselves to power their own cellular respiration. The energy that is left over is used to create plant biomass, which is essentially plant material such as leaves, stems, and roots. Net primary productivity is gross primary productivity minus the energy the autotrophs used for its own cellular respiration. We perform secondary production when we use energy from the food we eat to build muscle, bone, and other essential biomass in our own bodies. Ecosystems vary in their productivity, which is the rate by which they convert energy into biomass. Ecosystems that convert solar energy into biomass quickly are said to have a high net primary productivity. Such ecosystems include tropical rainforests, coral reefs, and algal beds. Algal beds and coral reefs both occur in water shallow enough to allow sunlight to reach the organisms beneath the surface. Tropical rainforests have high net primary productivity, because of the rich and lush vegetation and the many layers of vegetation. Ecosystems with low net primary productivity include the desert, open ocean, the tundra, and alpine areas. These areas have low primary productivity due to the lack of vegetation, which is a result of climate, water depth, and/or altitude. This map shows the net primary productivity of ecosystems across the globe. Notice that net primary productivity varies geographically with temperature and precipitation. Here are some questions to consider as you study this figure. 1. What do the areas in red have in common? 2. There are areas of blue and purple on land and on the oceans. Do you know why oceans are colored this way? What about the land? Systems can operate in a circular process in which the output serves as the input for the system. When this happens, it's called a feedback loop. There are two types of feedback loops, positive and negative. A negative feedback loop is when the output results in the system moving in an opposite direction than it was originally headed. Negative feedback loops have a stabilizing effect. Essentially, the output negates the input for the system. Your body's temperature regulation system is an example of a negative feedback loop. When you get hot, you sweat, and you ultimately cool down. Do you see how the system changed directions? A positive feedback loop is when the output feeds and drives the cycle to continue along the same path. An example of a positive feedback loop is sunlight melting snow and ice in a warming climate. In cool climates, the sun is reflected off of white surfaces, such as snow and ice. But as the climate warms, more and more of the ice and snow melt, exposing darker ground. The dark ground absorbs heat rather than reflecting it. The ground surface the snow and ice develops on is now warmer than normal, and therefore less likely to develop new ice and snow. In this way, the cycle is perpetuating the pattern without a mechanism to stop or stabilize. Human population growth is another example of a positive feedback loop. More people means more people have babies, and the population continues to grow. The new babies are the output, but when the babies develop into sexually reproductive adults, they become the input. The loop drives itself further along the same path and doesn't have a mechanism by which it can stabilize. Systems are comprised of many individual parts, and oftentimes the whole is more than the sum of its parts. When this happens, it is called an emergent property. This means that the parts work together to create a system that can do something that the parts cannot do by themselves as individual parts. For example, trees provide habitat, oxygen, absorb carbon dioxide, and are a critical element of a forest ecosystem. The tree is made up of leaves, branches, a trunk, water, chloroplasts, and a variety of other components. However, if you isolated the chloroplast, this component of the tree could not provide a habitat to a bird. Looking at this at a larger scale, we can see that ecosystems are abounding with emergent properties. Ecosystems provide clear air and water, control erosion, and provide us with food. It is the many parts of the system working together that allow the ecosystem to provide us these essential goods and services. Another non-science example of an emergent property is a bicycle. If you took a bike apart into all its many pieces, you couldn't ride it to get from point A to point B. But together, the parts have an emergent property in that they create a device for transportation. Can you think of any other things with an emergent property? We can describe the emergent properties in the natural world as ecosystem services, meaning that the ecosystem is providing us a service which we cannot provide for ourselves. Ecosystem services are processes such as nutrient cycling, waste filtration, removing toxins, and food production. Ecosystem services can also be services that provide a place or a product that we use, such as providing recreational opportunities, aesthetic, educational, and spiritual amenities for us. This is only a short list of the services ecosystems provide for us that we can't entirely and efficiently replicate. Table 5.1 provides an excellent list of some of the many ecosystem services that we benefit from. Although it's difficult, economists and scientists developed a way to estimate the economic value of all Earth's ecosystem services. A team in the 1990s estimated the value of these services, but to make the task manageable, they focused on 17 key ecosystem services from 16 different biomes. The team determined that the value of resources from these biomes range from $16 to $54 trillion per year, with an average of $33 trillion. This amounts to $48 billion in 2013 dollars when adjusted for inflation. For comparison, the sum total of the gross national products of every nation in 1997 was only 18 trillion. Thus, nature had a value of 1.8 times higher than the entire economic activity of all nations on the planet. Furthermore, this estimate value of ecosystem services is an underestimation because it does not include data on all ecosystems. One community that knows all too well the value of ecosystem services is the Chesapeake Bay, which is on the east coast of the U.S. Chesapeake Bay is 200 miles long, stretching from Maryland to Virginia. The bay is an estuary, which is a body of water where fresh and salt water mix together. The Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary of more than 100 in the U.S. and is the third largest in the world. This area was once a thriving system rich in blue crabs, oysters, scallops, and fish such as giant sturgeon and striped bass. People flocked to this area because of the abundance of natural resources. Economies and cities were built up based on the harvesting of the seafood in the bay. People built their lives around this bay and it became a popular destination for tourism. However, like many natural resources and systems, the Chesapeake Bay is now a mere shadow of its former glory. In the 1880s, the Chesapeake Bay was the world's largest oyster fishery, but by 2010, the bay's oyster populations were only 1% of their historical abundance. Overharvesting, habitat destruction, oyster diseases, and water pollution have nearly wiped out the once abundant and rich oyster population and reduced the abundance of other sea life in the bay. The loss of these resources has monetary impacts as well. It's estimated that the fishery collapse in the Chesapeake Bay cost $4 billion in lost revenue in Maryland and Virginia between 1980 and 2010. The green shaded region on the map represents the watershed of Chesapeake Bay and is about 64,000 square miles. A watershed is an area of land where all the water that is in it or falls within it drains off into a singular outlet. The singular outlet is often a river draining into the sea or a bay. Think of a shower-bathtub combination as a model watershed. The edges of the tub are the edges of the watershed. The drain is the one singular outlet of the watershed. When it rains, i.e. the shower is turned on, the water falls within the watershed, i.e. the tub, and ultimately makes its way to the outlet because of a slope in the land towards the outlet, i.e. the drain. In this way, all the water within the watershed flows to the outlet. Within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as with most large watersheds, there are tens of thousands of streams which eventually flow to the bay. Along the way, these streams pick up sediment and pollution from a variety of sources, including forests, industry, cities, and farms. The streams carry the pollution and sediment downriver to the bay. One of the key pollutants in this system is excess nitrogen and phosphorus. You can see in the pie charts where the nutrients are coming from. As you can see, fertilizer use in agriculture and urban and suburban areas and wastewater from municipal and industrial sources are significant contributors of phosphorus and nitrogen entering the Chesapeake Bay. If you're not already aware of it, fertilizer is predominantly nitrogen and phosphorus. When these nutrients get too high in water, they cause hypoxic conditions, as is indicated by the call-out map of the bay on the right. Notice the color scale on the call-out. Dark orange areas indicate anoxic conditions, and just above that, as indicated by a lighter orange to yellow, are hypoxic conditions. As a reminder, hypoxic conditions are when there are low levels of dissolved oxygen in the water, and anoxic conditions are when there is no dissolved oxygen in the water. The oyster collapse of the Chesapeake Bay is considered a wicked problem because it is an incredibly complex issue involving many different stakeholders, and the source of the problem is complex. Furthermore, as the problem continues, the nature of the issue changes, which means developing a solution to the problem will require a great deal of planning, cooperation, and funding from the many different stakeholders. The process by which excess nitrogen and phosphorus can cause hypoxic or anoxic conditions is called eutrophication. Eutrophication starts when fresh water carrying nitrogen and phosphorus flows into a water body. The input of these nutrients does the same thing in water as it does on land. It causes things to grow, specifically algae and phytoplankton. The algae and phytoplankton initially increase the dissolved oxygen in the water through photosynthesis. However, this trend doesn't last, and soon the algae and phytoplankton die and drift to the bottom where bacteria consume them. As the bacteria consume the dead autotrophs, the bacteria also consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide. As microbial populations of decomposers increase, the decomposers consume more and more oxygen, driving the system into a hypoxic or anoxic condition. When this happens, the area is termed a dead zone or a hypoxic zone, and the aquatic life suffers and dies. There is a large dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that runs along the coast of Texas and Louisiana. The water there contains less than 2 milligrams per liter dissolved oxygen, which is the technical classification for hypoxic. Hypoxic or dead zones are well documented around the world. Notice the dead zones are offshore of areas with high ecological footprints. The image in the bottom right is figure 5.10 in your book. In the top left is an image of a normal lake. This lake could also be described as oligotrophic, which is a water body with low levels of dissolved nutrients and algae and high levels of dissolved oxygen. Notice the water is blue and clear. The lake on the right is experiencing an algal bloom due to excess nutrient input, i.e., this lake is a eutrophic lake. The lake on the bottom is also a eutrophic lake. The image of the fish floating on the surface shows one of the effects of eutrophication. The nitrogen and phosphorus that cause eutrophication come from a variety of activities throughout a watershed. Farms that apply fertilizer or that raise farm animals can be a source of these nutrients. When it rains, excess fertilizer runs off the farmland and pollutes the water. Additionally, animal feces rich in nitrogen and phosphorus can also run off farmland when it rains. Cities, urban areas, industries, and lumber operations can also be a source for these nutrients. All of these are examples of stormwater pollution or stormwater runoff. Stormwater runoff is the water that runs over the surface of the land after a rain event. This water picks up pollutants and carries them to nearby creeks and streams. You can help prevent eutrophication by not fertilizing your lawn right after a rain event, and by picking up your pet's waste when they defecate in your yard or while out on walks. Eutrophication can be prevented by judicious application of fertilizer, better management of stormwater runoff, and by overall reducing the sources of nitrogen and phosphorus that are released into the environment. This concludes this mini lecture on environmental systems, ecosystem ecology, eutrophication, and the Chesapeake Bay. Please see the week's main page in eCampus for additional details regarding the assignments required for this week. Thanks and gig 'em.